Welcome to this final episode of a podcast series that's exploring the threshold between collapse and renewal, otherwise known as Between Now and Next. I'm Annie Browning, and I'm always grateful to be with you and to share this conversation together. We've explored 4 different topics and themes right now, and our final theme is exploring and engaging in the topic of the becoming, how we embody new ways of being, and how we translate some of the skills and the reflections, the essence of our prior conversations into a radical new way of being, especially in an increasing, polarizing, and changing world. So, as always, in this episode, we're going to weave together some stories, some research on habit formation. We'll talk about cognitive embodiment, and always with some timeless wisdom from spiritual and consciousness traditions, so that we can live more congruently in terms of our values with practical strategies in regard to the future we want to create. And the goal is that it's not someday out there, that it's actually the world that we want to be right now. I always begin with a personal story that I believe speaks to the idea of what it means to navigate these thresholds that draw from where we've been and give hints of where we're going. And in that way, you are not lost. You are not in a space that is devoid of information where you don't know where you're going and where and how things will turn out. Instead, there are plenty subtle cues that are being given along the way. And here is an example. So it's been almost over 20 years ago now, about 20 years ago now, that I was working as a pastor in a congregation. And at that point in time, there were 2 small groups that decided, and it was prompted by an individual who had an economics background, prompted to try what would we call a social currency. And so these 2 small groups decided to develop this social currency. It were these little wooden tokens. And the 2 small groups agreed that each person had a certain number of tokens, and the tokens would be exchanged for goods and services. And I believe the experiment, the practice went on for maybe a year or 2, and it was actually pretty interesting. And this was, of course, well before Uber and Lyft. And so the social currency was often used for rides to the airport or to help with moving, babysitting. Sometimes there were goods exchanged, like homemade meals. Sometimes there was yard work that needed to be done. It really ran the gamut. Sometimes there was more technical support that was needed, between members of the groups. And so this social currency exchanged, and there was a way of kind of naming that you had a need, and then people would offer the currency. And what was interesting was, it was, intended as a way to generate community building and connection and collective engagement with one another. But it also, of course, developed really deep and meaningful relationships between the members of the groups. And these were intergenerational groups. So it was also creating some opportunities to connect with and network with individuals that maybe just wouldn't normally be in a social circle. So then fast forward to right now. And literally this happened today. So I was in, a conversation with someone. We are working on a joint project together. We got to the place where we were talking about payment. And out of the blue, this individual mentioned the idea of a social exchange between us. The ability for goods and services not to be exchanged monetarily, but through essentially an exchange of services. But the word social currency was used. And in that moment, I had this flash of noticing how there may be a need or a drive or a call for a different way of exchanging not just services, but goods and supplies and what's needed. And a social currency is not new. This is, of course, an ancient idea. It's been replicated in many other systems. But why now? Why was that brought forward in this moment? And how might I get a hint of an experience that I would have had in the past that somehow was flashing forward into the future right now? So that's really what it means to begin to develop an inner navigation that is present in the threshold moments and beginning to intuit and notice in an embodied way. You notice I had kind of a flash of insight that jolted through my body when that word was brought up. And this is about the fact that there's an internal transformation, an unlearning of decades of embodied patterns around time, success, money, and relationships, and the order in which they fall. In order to know that those old habits are wanting to transform so that new possibilities can come forward. And it's perfectly fine for all of us to note that some days we vacillate between being stuck in an old pattern and feeling the possibility of what the future is. And in this conversation, there was a point in which I noticed my ego rising, and I just wanted to pay the individual. Not really, because all of us, of course, are judicious with money, maybe, or just, wanting to use money wisely. But really, it was around the fact that I was uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable with something that wasn't so transactional as exchanging resources in terms of a dollar value. And of course, we'll follow all the business ethics needed to justify the exchange. So I'm not saying there's anything illegal here. Instead, it's more about those old habits, those familiar patterns in terms of how exchanges occur. And in that way, the transformation, the embodied practice isn't just abstract or distant. It's in our daily work. It's in these future possibilities in a present reality, in how we move, how we speak, we make decisions and relate. Everything that I just gave in that little case study. It's not about perfection, but about increasing our congruence between our deepest values and our lived experience, really creating what philosophers call integrity, which is wholeness and non-fragmentation between what we believe and how we live. So let's dig into the research together. So research tells us that embodied practices shape our capacity to participate in systemic change. So when we think about transformation, we often focus only on cognitive understanding in terms of structural change. Do I understand it? And can I make sense of what's happening in terms of structure? Both are necessary. However, embodied cognition notes that our thinking primarily rises from our embodied experience. In that way, cognition isn't just confined to the brain. It's the mind outside of a mind, which includes the mind in a body and our perception of experiences that are beyond our mind, but arises from that dynamic interaction between brain and body and environment. So this embodied perspective is neurobiologically founded in consciousness. So that's revealing our sense of self, values, and these decision-making processes that are rooted in bodily states and feelings. Often our most rational choices that we deem to be rational are actually more emotional and somatic markers that are defining our thinking awareness. So when we think of the great turning, right, these big moments in time in which our consciousness shifts, they will not come primarily through intellectual persuasion, but through practices that alter our felt experience of relationship with the world. I want to repeat that again. These great turnings that have happened over time will not happen through intellectual persuasion, but through the felt practices, the felt experiences of our relationship with the living world. And we know that when we are experiencing deep interconnection, so that sense of intertwining with one another and with experiences in the world, with phenomena, when we have that deep interconnection, that's where change occurs. That's where patterns begin to change. That's where we notice shifts happening between humans and their material context. So anything that's in our purview, the natural world, the experiential world, the mystical world, all these realms that we are engaging with, when we have a felt sense of them, a felt experience of them, that is what slowly creates change. And perhaps the most kind of encouraging point that I want to bring forward in terms of research is that deeply ingrained patterns change through practice. And anyone who's gone to the gym for 30 days knows this, but longitudinal studies of contemplative practices, meditation, mindfulness, expanded states of consciousness like gaze induces, that these are regular embodied practices. They create change in terms of the brain function and structure, especially with regions of the brain that are responsible for attention, emotional regulation, and empathic responses. Attention, emotional regulation, and empathic response. And that is exactly what we need the most to navigate very complex transitions and changes with wisdom and also with compassion. So there's a great tale that speaks around how we receive guidance or wisdom in the relationship between practice and how it creates a different state of being in our life. And many of you have probably heard this story, fully attributing it to the Cherokee tradition from the Native American history. And it's this powerful lens for embodying becoming. So an elder was teaching his grandson about life. He said, a fight is going inside of us. It's a terrible fight between two wolves. One wolf is anger, fear, jealousy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. What was old, even what is now. The other stands for joy and peace, love, hope, sharing, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, friendship, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. This same fight is always occurring within you, within me, within us, all of us. And a granddaughter spoke up and said for a minute, after thinking, grandfather, which wolf will win? And the elder replied, the one that you feed. In essence, what we practice is what we become. What we practice is what we become. Where we place our attention is what we become. The qualities we embody through repeated attention and action grow stronger, while those we actively and intentionally neglect will grow weaker. And this principle is not just for individual development, but for our collective transformation. It is not calling us to deny that there is fear, anger, greed in our world, and that those are natural to our human experience. But in consciousness, we choose which pattern to strengthen through attention and practice. And specifically, when we look at the gaze method, which we will practice in the upcoming event, when we look at the gaze method, it actively works to reduce fear, increase experiences of love. And through that parallel experience, we find ourselves in a state of interconnection that is where healing happens. And in this practice, it is not a mental exercise. We are intentionally entering an expanded state of consciousness in which the default mode network is powering down, in which our executive functioning is quieting, and we are entering a timeless, spaceless, selfless reality, an experience that is so powerful to actually get a handlehold on what is between now and next. And so when we are in times of transition, expanded states of consciousness that truly generate wisdom are so relevant, particularly relevant as we navigate between old habits and new possibilities. I invite you to hear the words of David Whyte and this poem of Start, Close, In. Start, Close, In speaks to the beginning transformation, not with grand gestures, but with the immediate territory of our own experience. Start, close, in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing. Close in. The step you don't want to take. Start with the ground you know, the pale ground beneath your feet. Your own way of starting the conversation. Start with your own question. Give up on other people's questions. Don't let them smother something simple. To find another's voice, follow your own voice. Wait until that voice becomes a private ear listening to another. Start right now. Take a small step you can call your own. Don't follow someone else's heroics. Be humble and focus. Start close in. Don't mistake that other for your own. Embodied transformation begins not with the abstraction of ideals or only staying on the distant horizon, but within that immediacy of our own experience, the ground beneath our feet, the conversation we're in right now, the step that we don't want to take. The path to becoming the future we hope to create starts with these small, authentic moves that arise from our particular position within the systems that we do want to change. So let's express and focus together on these 3 conscious strategies for embodied becoming. And these are ones that we can practice each and every day, not as aspirational practices, but lived practices that bring future possibilities into present reality. So it starts with micro movements that support systemic shifts. So it's in the minutia that we move mountains. Small actions that are aligned with deeper systemic properties can catalyze disproportionate effects. So let me say it in a different way. When we have intervention points, things that we do, little micro movements, it shifts our mindsets and the paradigms from which these systems start to arise. So you may identify one thing that you will do. It doesn't need to be this wholesale change of trying to overhaul a whole system. A micro movement, a small, repeatable action that replicates a different kind of relationship. How might you subtly shift the words, metaphors, or questions that you use? How may you change your language? Going back to time, how may you alter your relationship with time in terms of pace and duration? And then space, how may you change the physical space around you to reflect an embodied presence? So let me give a small example for each. First of all, a language move. You may be familiar with the idea of only reserving the words "I'm sorry" for what is truly rising from a place of genuinely asking or inviting an attitude of forgiveness. We say "I'm sorry" or "okay" as throwaway terms. So how may you subtly shift the words you say so they are aligned with integrity that reflects who you are? In terms of time, how often do we say, "I'm too busy, I don't have time"? What might it be like to change your relationship to time, in which time is abundant? There is more time than ever to focus on what is most important to you. And how would that change your reality? And then in terms of space, we look at deficit instead of abundance. Where and how might you reorchestrate your space so that it reflects exactly what you want to become? Whether it be a touchstone or a memento or something tangible that helps you feel the alive world right in your own living room. And we know that consistency rather than intensity over time is what will have greater impact than any sort of dramatic big intervention. The second strategy is to essentially develop congruence within yourself. Congruence that will support you to develop that inner compass, that navigation system that helps you know where you're going and what is most important to you and what the next step may be. In that way, you are looking at essentially these congruences between what you value, what's most important to you, what is essential for you, how you are spending your resources and your time, and also around what you most want. In the gaze method, we use 3 sacred questions over and over that are intended to define congruence for you. So the questions that are often asked are drawn off of Leo Tolstoy's great story called The 3 Questions. And these are adaptations of the questions, but they get at the heart of what is congruent within you. And the questions are, what do you want? The second question is, what is most important right now? And the third question, what is your next step? Or what is calling to you? And in that way, you are developing congruence between those three levels, identifying what you want, what is core to you, what you deeply value and believe, and what is primary in terms of your motivation. The second layer is looking at what is most important right now, which also gets at how you're spending your time and your energy. Where are you giving yourself away or aligning your energy and your time and your resources with what you most need and want? The third layer is noticing what is calling to you, how there is congruence between how you live and then also how you appear and how you show up in the world. And when we have alignment between those three levels, that is the sort of structured reflection that can support us to overcome these unconscious barriers, those barriers that would say, I will never get over this, nothing will ever change, and I'm limited by certain aspects of your life or by really your own thinking patterns. When we develop these deliberate practices, it can gradually increase our inner and then our exterior experiencing and the coherence that can develop between the two. And finally, in terms of somatics, and this is where gathering a group once again is so essential. It is important to be in the same room with others. It develops a capacity for presence, to truly be with one another in live, real time. Yes, sometimes we need to gather virtually, but when we are in a social engagement system, it supports connection, creativity, and collaboration. In these kind of somatic groups, really these social engagements, any group that you gather, it's important to perhaps have one spiritual practice that you can try. And this is why I'm hosting this event coming up, so that you can experience one practice that you may choose to use in part as you gather in community to help it enter expanded states. But at a base level, simply gathering together to breathe, to pray, to meditate, to contemplate, no matter what method you use, the tradition or the history, it's really about gathering and allowing a practice to expand the space, allowing a practice to begin to create that social engagement that is for creativity, for connection, and collaboration. And we know that when we are in groups and we engage in some sort of embodied practice, whether it be breath, movement, really deep prayer states, when we actually are just metaphorically shoulder to shoulder with one another in each other's energy, then we notice that patterns will automatically start to shift. It bypasses our cognitive defenses, and we can come more available, especially when challenging patterns start to emerge. So as we wrap up together, I really invite you to consider what the threshold is that you are exploring right now. A space that perhaps is unique for you between what is breaking down and falling away and what's emerging. It isn't just an external territory. It really starts with an internal one. And the systems we have inherited are breaking down precisely because they embody ways of being that are fundamentally at odds with the pattern of life that is bringing us back into wholeness. They are breaking down because they embody ways of being that are fundamentally at odds with what is a pathway of wholeness for all of us. And the systems that we seek aren't going to be fully formed. They're not going to come in a neat package where we just unbox them and say, oh, here it is. Instead, it becomes emergent because of our willingness to practice different ways of being in relationship with one another, with ourselves, with our time, with our attention, resources, and starting to develop the capacity to engage with an other than human world. This is where expanded states of consciousness come in, and it's why they are so important. It diversifies our perspective from one orientation of reality that is perhaps only 1 or 2 dimensional to 3D and 5D dimensional orientation. It will not happen perfectly all at once, but in humble, consistent practice, life-using gaze, we can become more congruent with the values that we want to live. So throughout this series, we've explored fracturing, emergence, integration, discernment, and now embodied being. And these aren't necessarily logical sequential steps. That's much of the old that is falling away. We're talking about Kairos time, Kairos steps that are far more fluid, interconnected, nonlinear, weaving, making their way as they go, showing us the breadcrumbs one at a time. Notice how we are just moving forward slowly and steadily by the cues and the invitation that are revealed to us in each and every moment. And the journey continues well beyond, these episodes in your lives and in your community. But remember that it is 1,000 small choices that do change the trajectory of our world and the changes that you long for in your life. As we move forward, I want to repeat the words of David White. Start close in. Start with the step you don't want to take. The ground beneath your feet, your own way of starting the conversation. We are not alone in this practice. Across the world, there are countless others, so many, who are engaging in similar work in their own context. And together, we are actually midwifing new possibilities between that threshold of now and next. Thank you for joining me for this exploration. I feel tears in my throat of gratitude for this time together. And as we go, may these insights and practices not remain just good ideas, but to support your journey of becoming and to creating the future that our world is desperately longing for and what we need to become. And it's not someday out there, but it's right now here in this moment.